Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Brie, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about neets, hikikomori, and modern society. So before I begin today's episode, I just want to say that I may be covering some sensitive topics, mainly in relation to triggers like suicide or self-harm. Now, if these particular triggers are very sensitive for you, it would be best to skip between parts in today's episode, or it would be better for you not to listen. So, in today's episode, I'm mainly going to be covering what neets and hikikomoris are, as well as why they became the way they are. And of course, I'm going to be speaking more about my general opinions of modern society. So without further ado, let's begin. So the term neet was coined in the United Kingdom, and this is an abbreviation which translates to someone who is not in any form of education, employment, or training. Now, in the case of hikikomori, this is a term coined by the Japanese, which describes a person who avoids every form of social contact. So in other words, a hikikomori is a social recluse that shuts themselves out of society, primarily by locking themselves in their room and hardly coming out whatsoever. Majority of people who tend to fall under these categories do have a form of social anxiety, disability, or even mental illnesses. And depending on the individual's experience, they could have instances where they've grown up in dysfunctional households, which led to a poor upbringing, some form of abuse, or maybe poor experiences during different stages of their life, like education system failing them, or being bullied or ostracized at work, that kind of thing. Now, whilst there are some people who intentionally choose to be a neet or a hikikomori, there are instances where some of them tend to give up on life because they feel that society has failed them, and understandably so in certain cases. You can't really blame people for shutting themselves out, considering that modern society does have its issues, which I will get to a little bit later. So there are some differences between neets and hikikomori. So neets can still have some form of a social life if they feel like it, and some even do activities like going to the gym or drawing and stuff like that. I mean, you've even got neets who make YouTube videos. So as of recently, I have been looking at the neet subreddit on the site Reddit, and I have seen a couple of links to YouTube videos where people who are neets actually talk about their lifestyle, as well as why they ended up the way they did, and how they've sort of transitioned out of society, or even transitioned back into society if they choose to rejoin. The same applies to hikikomori, where on the hikikomori subreddit, I have seen people who, again, share their experiences. So, for example, there was this one YouTuber that I discovered, I believe, early this year called Zombie Beats 2000. Although, from what I'm aware, she is no longer a hikikomori. But back in the early 2010s, she was a hikikomori that often stayed home and barely socialized with people. And from what my understanding was, she seemed to have some sort of mental health issues. And she was pretty popular on the internet, although nowadays, and understandably so, she kind of leads a normal life. And, you know, I can't really blame her for wanting to delete traces of herself off the internet, because sometimes with internet fame, it can be very difficult to adjust to life when people want to know so much about you. And all you want to do is just kind of keep a low profile. Now, in the case of the hikikomoris, they often have a habit of closing themselves off from the world, and they don't really talk to anyone, not even their own family. So when it comes to neets and hikis, and this is actually going to be connected to my general opinion on modern society, they often get ridiculed a lot. So the way modern society functions is that it's built for extroverts. The entire world is built for outgoing social butterflies. And if you're introverted or you have anything else that makes you look quote unquote different, the main issue is that you will end up in a position where you will be judged for who you are. And being an autistic person that has some level of social anxiety / social awkwardness, although I am not neat or hicky due to the fact that I obviously have a full-time job and have finished education, I do relate more to neets and hikikomori than I do normal people, because I know how it feels to be ostracized, especially as I used to be bullied in secondary school to a point where I was driven to near suicide. So the thing with modern society is that life nowadays tends to revolve around your job title and your earnings. So usually when two strangers meet for the first time, the first question that is often asked is either what do you do or what do you do for a living? And the question naturally correlates to a job title. So if somebody presents as a neet or a hickey, like I said, society becomes very judgmental. So the person in question would be classed as a scrounger if, say, they're claiming benefits. And for those that don't know, this is a UK term for somebody who is lazy, that claims benefits. And of course, this term is often thrown around by mainstream media, especially in shows that encourage poverty porn, like Benefits Britain, Life on the Dole, or Jeremy Kyle, which was discontinued or cancelled, that kind of thing. So when it comes to modern society and jobs, there are certain professions that are often respected more than others. So typically, if somebody falls under a category where they're doing a blue-collar job or a minimum wage job, they tend to be ridiculed, because typically if you do minimum wage, so if say you're working in a retail store as a sales assistant, or you're working in a McDonald's on a till or flipping burgers, people assume that you can't do any better, and you tend to be asked really stupid questions such as, why didn't you go to university? Why didn't you get a better job? Is this all you can do? That kind of thing. So basically, society looks down on people that do these types of jobs, although some of these jobs are actually essential. So, you need plumbers to fix drains, you need engineers to sort out your IT, and maybe electrics and stuff like that. Same with electricians. You need sanitation officers to clear up garbage so that it doesn't stink up an area or cause pollution. You need healthcare assistants, doctors, nurses, etc. And speaking of essential jobs, something that I find a bit ironic is the fact that during the pandemic in particular, you had this whole clap for the NHS thing in the UK, where people would get out of their houses and clap for NHS workers at 8 o'clock every evening. And it was almost as if there was this real life edition of George Orwell's 1984 taking place. So if you haven't read the book, it basically is about Big Brother and how it controls its citizens, if that makes sense. And that's kind of how the whole clap for the NHS thing felt to me. It just seemed very artificial, as if the government was programming people to initiate this one action. And for me personally, when it comes to essential jobs, I'm not going to stand and clap at a certain time to show fake appreciation, because I see any worker as a person. I mean, maybe this is because I have had an experience where I used to work in a minimum wage job. Although it was an admin assistant role, I actually was paid minimum wage. And I'm not going to disrespect somebody who works a minimum wage job just because I'm in a council job now and I'm getting paid more. Because, I mean, regardless of what job you do, you are deserving of respect. So, back to the point regarding modern society and jobs. If someone was to do a white-collar job, say in a corporate office, they would be admired and respected, because typically white-collar jobs, especially in corporate, present so many opportunities, whereas according to the majority of people, minimum wage jobs are seen as a dead end. So there's no room for progression or pay increases or anything like that. And the only way you can get any of these things is by changing jobs. And in relation to neets and hickeys, of course, people ask very invasive questions. Things like, when are you having children? When are you getting married? Why aren't you in school? Why aren't you in college? Why don't you have a job? And the why don't you have a job question is a very frequent question that is asked to neets and hickeys. And anyone who falls under this category tends to lie about their personal lives just to get people to back off. So if somebody's like a neet, for example, they could be saying something along the lines of, oh, I'm just in school finishing my lawyer degree or something. So they would just bullshit, just straight up bullshit to get people off their back. And I don't really blame them, because most people gossip about you. And I know how that feels, again, because during my educational years, mainly in secondary school, I had experiences where girls would talk to me in my face, trying to be nice to me or pretending to be nice to me. And then behind my back, they would just say things that would make me feel a certain type of way. Hence why I don't like trusting people. Now, the sad thing about modern society is the fact that people measure your worth based on your job and earnings. And I think women in particular do this because a lot of modern women nowadays tend to want a perfect 10. So they want a man who is going to provide a lot of money to fund their expensive lifestyle that they can't afford. And unfortunately, I knew a person who was like this, so I'm not going to mention this person by name, but all I'm going to say is that I had an ex-friend who attended the same secondary school as me, and I knew this person for about 10 plus years, and when they moved to the US, they became very materialistic. So they would always brag about all these parties and things that they would go to. And they actually told me that they wouldn't date a guy if he worked in a McDonald's, which I think is a bit stupid. And I mean, in my case, I know lots of people who've done minimum wage jobs. I know people who've been on benefits. I know people who work in what are considered dead-end jobs like retail or customer service. And again, just because I have a decently paid job in a local council, it doesn't mean I'm going to judge my friends if they work in a minimum wage profession or whatever, because it's like, the way I see things is, again, you're a person, you have feelings, you have some form of agency, and I'm not going to treat you any different because you earn less than me. I just think it's very superficial. And, you know, speaking of people, there are lots of people in this world who I feel have ulterior motives. So nowadays, lots of people will only befriend you or get into relationships with you because they know that you have something they want. So there's always an ulterior motive. And again, I know from personal experience because people I remember in secondary school used to want to befriend me because I had a lot of equipment. So I used to get girls asking me if I could lend them a pen or a pencil, and I did because I was a very nice person, almost too nice to a point where I would easily be taken advantage of. And in most instances, I often had people just losing my stuff, and I would get really upset, and they would just kind of brush things off without fully understanding why I felt a certain type of way, which was something that I really didn't like. And again, the same thing applied to my ex-friend, although in the case of that particular person, I felt like I was a friend for convenience. So basically, I was an emotional punching bag that would be present when they had issues that they caused themselves due to their toxic and materialistic mentalities. Two combinations which I think are some of the worst combinations you can get in a person. So in other words, there was a very one-sided friendship because I was the main person putting my problems aside to support someone else and dismissing my own health and well-being, which was something I sacrificed a lot. And nowadays, I'm trying not to do that anymore because I find that lots of people will take advantage of me anyway. So that's why I keep my walls up, and I will always keep my walls up. But when it comes to modern society, in my opinion, there are three main factors that keep the world running: narcissism, consumerism, and materialism. So people don't have care for each other, and people are constantly trying to one-up each other. And if someone is struggling, they are left to deal with things on their own. So say somebody has a mental health issue. Society campaigns for all the support in the world, but then they tend to shut that person down and make them feel insignificant. So there you go. That is what modern society is. A place where you have no real sense of community, where people come together when necessary. In turn, you just have a fast-paced nature where people are so concerned about themselves, rushing to get to wherever, and also just going on mind-numbing social media platforms instead of paying attention to their surroundings. And to add to consumerism and materialism, you often have a lot of people working 2 to 3 jobs, spending money on things they don't need to impress people they don't like. So in other words, there's a keeping up with the Joneses mentality that exists, where people are just inflating their own bruised ego. And another thing that I find concerning about modern society is a hustle culture mentality. So in this world, you're often expected to dedicate yourself to jobs 24/7. And if you are not productive enough, according to the so-called hustle culture quote-unquote gurus, you are not productive. You are lazy if you don't put your heart, body and soul into your work. And in turn, when you are working 24/7, you're damaging your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So you end up with burnout, you end up with long-term mental health issues, or you die. And in certain countries, particularly the US and Japan, many workers get 3 to 4 hours of sleep. So I remember watching a documentary, for example, which was regarding Japanese salarymen, most of which who were putting in more than 10 to 12 hours a day in their jobs, because in the Japanese culture, if you do your required hours, your boss and your co-workers see you as lazy. And the main issue is that you have a lot of people who will look down on you just because you want to just do your required hours, go home and get paid. And I mean, to be completely honest, if you're working and you just want to do your required hours, go home and get paid, I don't really blame you, because I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't hate my job myself, but my main priority will always be getting paid, because at the end of the day, you need money in order to make ends meet. And it is the truth. So anyone who thinks the opposite, I think something is slightly wrong with you. So back to my point regarding the hustle culture mentality. When you think about the way life works, right? You have 24 hours in a day. And the concept of a perfect life is supposed to involve 8 hours each divided for work, sleep, and recreational time. So the average full-time worker works for 40 hours a week, Monday to Friday, for 8 hours each day, spending time often completing monotonous tasks in order to receive money. When the average full-timer is working, they don't consider the fact that there's additional tasks relating to their job, mainly the preparation for the working day and the commute, which could add up to about 60 plus hours a week, depending on how much time it takes to prepare to go to work and how much time it takes to commute. And the sad thing is that you don't have much time for decompression, because when you come home, the only thing you can often do, or the only things you can do, are eating and having a shower and going to bed, because you have to repeat the cycle. And if you're lucky, yes, you get weekends off, but then you're often spending your time doing errands or handling personal responsibilities like childcare, and you have to mentally prepare for the next working day. Now, in the case of neets and hickeys, a lot of them don't want to work, and understandably so. And judging from what I've read on the neet and hickey subreddits, the main reasons why people in these categories choose not to have a job is because of the above, in terms of the amount of time spent working and preparing for work, and also because of additional issues that take place at work, such as office politics, bullying, micromanagement, forced overtime, low pay, lack of benefits and opportunities for progression, and lack of work-life balance. Usually it's easier for them to avoid work as much as possible, or to do jobs where there's little interaction with co-workers, managers, or customers, because as per mentioned earlier, a lot of people who fall under the neat and hickey categories often have some form of social anxiety or some sort of disability. And understandably so, if you put those two things in a combination and you add in a social environment, the person is probably going to have a meltdown. And again, this depends on the individual, because some people would take time to adjust but can sort of cope better than others. But the point I'm explaining here is that lots of people who are neat or hickey who slowly transition into the workplace tend to come out because of the issues I mentioned, and then their self-esteem is damaged to a point where they don't want to work. And usually, if a former neat or hickey is working and experiences mental health issues or has a disability like autism, a lot of co-workers and even managers shun them. And the thing with modern workplaces is that neurotypical people in particular virtue signal for better mental health support or accommodation. And in the UK, where I'm from, you have employers advertising themselves as quote unquote disability confident. So the main issue is that if someone, again, as I mentioned, opens up about mental health or a disability, they get shunned. And the neurotypicals decide who gets to be in their exclusive club and who doesn't, driving former neets and hickeys out of the workplace. And of course, managers don't do much, because in a lot of modern workplaces, managers and even human resources teams encourage toxic behavior. And as the old saying goes, it always starts at the top. So a lot of people tell neets and hickeys that they are often expected to contribute to society by working. And unfortunately, this is the traditional mindset that many apply in life, that in order to contribute to society, you have to have a job. But what people fail to understand is not everyone has a job because they want to contribute to society. Most people have a job because, again, as I mentioned, you need money to make ends meet. And that is the main purpose, because without money, you don't have food, you don't have clothes, you don't have water, you don't have toiletries, let alone a roof over your head and all the materialistic desires you wish for. Even social activities can be too much for neets and hickeys depending on personal circumstances. And due to people comparing them to others who are more successful, they feel like failures. So you might have a parent who has a child that's neat or hickey that compares them to a friend's child or a cousin or a sibling or something. And the person who falls under the neat or hickey category feels inadequate because they are seen as not good enough. They'll be questioned as to why they're such a failure, and people will make fun of them, causing them to feel a certain type of way. Another thing that is actually depressing about the neat and hickey lifestyle is that people try to offer help, which makes their situation worse. So people try to offer things like recommending therapy or getting the neat or hickey into studies or work or something. But again, that doesn't work for everyone because it doesn't delve into underlying issues that have affected them for a long time. And of course, if neets or hickeys talk about their struggles, most people say you need to get a thick skin, get over it, this is life, you have to cope. And people who are quote unquote normal are basically complacent. They accept life as it is and have little sympathy for people who fall under neets or hickey categories. And it's ironic because, again, as mentioned, there are campaigns regarding mental health, but no one does anything about it because half the time people don't give a shit. Now, if neets or hickeys have a really poor lifestyle, they resort to suicide or, in some cases, self-harm. But for some who resort to suicide, the main concern is that they might try to kill themselves and whatever method is used might not work, because you do have people who attempt suicide and the method doesn't work. The person gets sick, or of course they end up in a position where they become a vegetable and are pretty much bedridden or something. And that's why neets and hickeys don't try suicide sometimes, because they know that the consequences could be pretty bad if they somehow end up alive. Now, to cope with pain, some people who are neat or hickey resort to recreational drugs like weed, because weed makes you zone out and whatever. And of course, it's like a temporary drug that numbs the pain. Some people resort to alcohol because obviously if you're drunk, you don't remember much the next day when you're hungover. Or some consider euthanasia, which is a term to describe painless killing of a patient. Even sleeping can count as a coping mechanism, because you have some people who are neat or hickey that sleep for more than 10 hours a day and they don't want to do anything because they don't want to deal with modern society. And in terms of medication, some neets or hickeys do use that, like antidepressants or something, or if they want, they might try and find harder stuff like fentanyl. Now, in terms of relationships, it can be very hard for neets and hickeys to find the right tribe or the right people to be a part of their life, because they feel like they don't have much to offer. If the neet or hickey is fully dependent on somebody, the other person will probably end the relationship because they don't want extra baggage weighing them down. And that's why most of them end up alone. In the case of familial relationships, you have instances where family ridicule neets and hickeys because they're not the ideal person society expects them to be. And depending on individual experiences, some neets or hickeys grow up in abusive households where family members are molding them like a piece of clay, creating the perfect image that they are supposed to maintain 24/7. In some cases, you have family members that would force neets or hickeys to get jobs and, of course, kick them out of the house. Now, in terms of good people in this world, sometimes I feel that they often suffer. They really do suffer. And it's like all the good people in the world, either suffer or die. And I feel at times all the bad people in the world tend to do a lot better, which really shouldn't be the case. Now, to conclude today's episode, I do want to mention that there is a lot when it comes to putting in effort to, I guess, achieve the perfect image. And there's a lot put into other people's opinions or perceptions of you. And I guess the best thing, especially if you're neat or hickey, is that it's important to live life on your own terms and to not let people treat you like a puppet. Now, if you are neat or hickey, you are welcome to this podcast, as I will not judge you. This podcast is meant to be a form of expression for myself, but also a way to help people relate to any issues that seem familiar to them. And of course, if you're neat or hickey, I don't really blame you from shutting out from society. So before I end today's episode, as always, I want to say thank you for listening, and I hope that you've enjoyed. I would also appreciate it if you left any comments or feedback, because every little bit of support counts. So the next episode, which is going to be released on the 14th of July in the next 2 weeks, will be about journaling. And in this particular episode, I'm going to be talking about how I use journaling for mental health, and also how having a consistent journal has helped me in terms of getting my thoughts out. So until the 14th of July, this is me, and I hope everyone has a really great day and enjoys the rest of their weekend. So for now, this is goodbye.